The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. In the heart of a tranquil suburban neighborhood stood a modest Victorian house, its paint weathered by time and its windows reflecting the ever-changing sky above. Within its walls lived Mrs. Mallard, a woman whose life seemed to echo the quiet sighs of the house itself, carrying the weight of unspoken desires and unfulfilled dreams. Mrs. Mallard was no stranger to the suffocating embrace of societal expectations. Married at a young age to Mr. Brently Mallard, a man of respectable stature and demeanor, she had found herself bound by the duties and obligations of marriage, her own hopes and aspirations buried beneath the weight of convention. Yet beneath her placid exterior lay a restless spirit yearning for something more, something beyond the confines of her narrow existence. On a fateful spring day, as the sun cast its golden rays over the sleepy neighborhood, news arrived at the Mallard household that would forever alter the course of Mrs. Mallard's life. It was Josephine, Mrs. Mallard's sister, who brought the tidings, her face drawn with sorrow as she delivered the words that would herald both tragedy and liberation. "Mrs. Mallard," Josephine whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "there has been an accident, Mr. Mallard. He is no longer with us." For a moment, Mrs. Mallard could not comprehend the gravity of Josephine's words. It felt as though the world had come to a standstill, the air thick with disbelief and uncertainty. Then, as the reality of her husband's passing began to sink in, a curious sensation washed over her, a mixture of shock, grief, and, inexplicably, a glimmer of something akin to relief. Alone in her room, Mrs. Mallard sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the swaying branches of the oak tree outside. In the silence that enveloped her, she felt a strange sense of clarity, as though a veil had been lifted from her eyes, revealing truths long obscured by the shadows of complacency. It was in that moment of solitude that Mrs. Mallard allowed herself to entertain a forbidden thought, a thought that had long been relegated to the darkest recesses of her mind. What if, she dared to wonder, this sudden loss was not merely a tragedy, but an opportunity? An opportunity to break free from the shackles of her marriage, to reclaim a semblance of autonomy that had been denied her for so long. The very notion sent a shiver down Mrs. Mallard's spine, mingling with the tendrils of grief that still clung to her heart. But amidst the sorrow there was also a flicker of something else, a spark of hope burning bright against the backdrop of her despair. As Mrs. Mallard sat lost in thought, the world outside her window seemed to come alive with newfound vibrancy. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the gentle caress of the breeze, all spoke to her in a language of liberation, beckoning her to step beyond the threshold of her sorrow and embrace the possibilities that lay beyond. With trembling hands, Mrs. Mallard rose from her seat and made her way to the door. Each step felt like a journey unto itself, a pilgrimage toward a destination unknown, yet somehow inevitable. And as she crossed the threshold and stepped out into the world, she felt a surge of exhilaration unlike anything she had ever known, a sense of freedom so profound it bordered on ecstasy. In that fleeting hour, as the sun danced upon her skin and the wind whispered secrets in her ear, Mrs. Mallard was a woman transformed. Gone was the meek and dutiful wife, replaced instead by a creature of boundless possibility, a creature unbound by the constraints of convention, liberated from the confines of expectation. But even as Mrs. Mallard reveled in her newfound freedom, a shadow lingered at the edge of her consciousness. A nagging doubt that whispered of the fragility of her happiness, the impermanence of her liberation. And sure enough, as she turned to re-enter the house, her moment of transcendence was shattered by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway, a sound that sent a chill racing down her spine, freezing her in place. With a sinking heart, Mrs. Mallard watched as the door swung open, revealing the figure of a man silhouetted against the fading light of day. It was Mr. Mallard, her husband, alive and well, his expression a mixture of relief and concern as he beheld his wife standing before him. Breathless and bewildered, Mrs. Mallard could do naught but stare, her mind reeling with disbelief. How could this be, she wondered, her thoughts a tumultuous whirlwind of confusion and despair. And yet, as Mr. Mallard crossed the threshold and gathered his wife into his arms, Mrs. Mallard felt a part of her wither and die. A part that had dared to dream, dared to hope, dared to believe in the possibility of a life unfettered by the constraints of convention. In the days that followed, as Mrs. Mallard resumed her role as dutiful wife and devoted companion, she found herself haunted by the memory of that fleeting hour, a memory that taunted her with its promise of liberation, its tantalizing glimpse of a reality that might have been. And though outwardly she remained the picture of composure, inwardly Mrs. Mallard was a woman adrift, a woman caught between the harsh realities of her existence and the tantalizing allure of the freedom she had tasted but once. In the end, it was not grief that consumed Mrs. Mallard, but a profound sense of loss, a loss not just of her husband but of the possibility of a life unbound by the expectations of others, a life lived on her own terms, free from the constraints of convention. And as she stood alone in the silence of her grief, Mrs. Mallard knew that though her hour of liberation had come and gone, its memory would linger on, a bitter-sweet reminder of the fleeting nature of freedom and the enduring power of the human spirit to transcend even the darkest of circumstances.